Friends, have you ever heard the story about the famous Reb Zusha of Anapoli, a great man, but he lived in poverty? His students tell the tale that the rabbi wanted to buy a beautiful gift for his wife, a beautiful dress, so he saved up 1 penny and another penny till he found the most beautiful fabric and he hired a tailor to sew the dress. Soon after placing the order with a local tailor, the rabbi noticed one day that his wife felt a little withdrawn, a little sad. Eventually, she said to her husband, "My dear husband, the tailor came by that day. He delivered this beautiful dress, but on his way out, he said, 'Oy vey.' So she said, 'What's bothering you, Sir Tailor?' He said, 'I'll tell you the truth.' He said, 'My daughter just got engaged.' Her groom, he saw that the father-in-law was a tailor and he's working day and night on a beautiful dress. He was sure that that dress was for his bride-to-be, the tailor's daughter. But then when he learned that the dress was not for the tailor's daughter, but for the rabbi's wife, and that the tailor couldn't even afford fabric for a new dress, even if he wanted to, the groom became upset. And so did the bride, and so did the mother. And now, there's an overall unpleasant atmosphere in my home, the tailor tells the rabbi's wife. When she hears about it, she said to my dear husband, I didn't think even twice. And on the spot, I told the tailor he can keep the dress for his daughter as a gift. Now you would think the rabbi would be upset, but he was so pleased with his wife's generosity, despite her own poverty. And he said, what you did was such a great deed. And he blessed her that the Almighty reward her with goodness many times over. But one thing remained on the rabbi's mind. Did you pay the tailor for his work? The rabbi's wife said, no, I didn't. I mean, after all, I gave him the whole garment as a gift. Why should I pay him for his work? Reb Zusha, the husband, said, will you look in the Torah portion of this week, Parshat Ki Teitzei, and what does it say there? Chapter 24, verse 15, it says, you shall give him his wage on his day, and don't let the sun set before you pay him, for he is poor, and he risked his life. Meaning it's a mitzvah to pay the workers their wages immediately when he completes his work, because he needs money to buy bread, to put it on the table. And here, this tailor was dreaming all the time while he was sewing about the profits he's going to make from the job that we gave him. He already mapped out how he's going to spend every penny. Is it his fault that you decided to be nice and give him that dress for his poor daughter? The mitzvah dictates that we pay him immediately, even before sunset, the rabbi tells his wife. You see, friends, this week's Torah portion has 74 commandments, more than any portion of the whole Torah. One of the weightier commandments, mitzvot, among them is the prohibition against delaying a worker's wages. And the Torah emphasizes that he says it's a positive and a negative commandment, meaning you shall give him his wage on his day is positive, and the flip side, don't let the sun set before you pay it, before the day shouldn't come to an end, before you pay him, because he's poor and he risked his life to make this happen. And we can deduce the mitzvah's gravity, considering that it is already appears in the book of Leviticus, where it says, don't oppress your fellow, don't rob him. That means the hired worker's wage should not remain with you overnight until the morning. I mean, you got to pay him right away. And yet, here in Deuteronomy, the Torah is repeating itself, indicating how serious this mitzvah is. And the sages tell us that one who delays a worker's wage actually violates 5 distinct prohibitions. Because the mitzvah is to pay the laborer his wage on the very day that he completes his work before sunset. And that applies to all kinds of service arrangements. Hourly workers, such as babysitters or housekeepers, who work for a few hours here and there, must be paid on the day of their work. Now there are laborers who work by the week or by the month. They have to be paid on the final day of each work period. And contractors who get paid by the job must be paid on the day their work is complete. Or the merchandise, or the day when the merchandise is delivered. Whatever they agree to terms on, you need to honor it. The point really is once the money becomes due, you got to pay it on that very day and not a day later. Now, much has really been said about the great care taken by our sages throughout the ages not to delay their wages workers. For example, I'll share with you a story, the famous story of Chaim Chizkiah Medini. He lived in the mid-1800s. He was actually the chief rabbi of the city Hebron in the Holy Land of Israel. And he wrote many books, including the famous encyclopedia called Sidei Chemed. This rabbi once brought a pair of shoes to the shoemaker for repair. When the work was done, the shoemaker came to the rabbi's home to deliver the shoes. It was an honor to fix the rabbi's shoes. But when the rabbi took out his money to pay, the shoemaker said, he had no cash on him to give the rabbi the change. But he said, Rabbi, don't worry. You know what? Pay me the next day. When you have the right exact amount of change, I'll take the money from you. No. The rabbi, the Sidei Chemed, he wouldn't hear of it. And he insisted on paying immediately. He says, I have an obligation to pay you today. Just because I don't have the exact change, should you go home empty-handed? So the rabbi tells the shoemaker. So actually a fascinating question arises, and one of the commentators have grappled with this for centuries. According to Jewish tradition, God doesn't just issue commandments. Symbolically, we say that he practices what he preaches, fulfilling his own commandments in a heavenly manner, symbolically. But yet, when it comes to paying the reward for his own workers, that's us, the Jewish people, who serve Hashem by keeping the Torah and the mitzvos, we find actually that Hashem is not giving the reward right after the mitzvah is completed. Rather, when we do a mitzvah, we are rewarded, we say, in the world to come after a person leaves this world. Now, the world, as we know it, has a lot of good people suffering. In stark contrast to the Torah's promise of good reward for those to fulfill Hashem, there are people that are doing God's work and they're having a hard time. So the classic explanation is given that this world is a place to work, while the reward comes in the world to come. Now, truth is, it could sound reasonable. Friends, but what's with the prohibition against delaying a worker's wages? Seemingly, if God delays a person's reward even by one day, he's actually failing to keep his own commandments. And we said God symbolically keeps them all. Now, some might be tempted to resolve this saying, you know what? The term of service of man doesn't end until a person finishes their life in this world. So God is giving it right. He's giving the reward right after you finish your service, and there's really no delay. But the truth is that in large part, the reward for keeping the mitzvot is delayed not only until a person's afterlife, but actually for much longer. Because we know that some of the reward comes on to us only when Mashiach will come. And when at that time will be the resurrection of the dead. And we believe that when the dead are resurrected and the soul comes back into the body, so the body and soul together will receive the reward for joining the forces during a person's lifetime because they fulfill God's will in a prior life. So seemingly, what comes out from here, that the reward is not just delayed by a day or a few days. Seemingly, someone like Abraham, the first Jew from a few thousand years ago, might have been waiting for his reward for close to 4,000 years. Well, let me share with you an insightful answer put forth by a great rabbi who lived in the late 17th century, early 18th century. They called him the Iyun Yaakov. Many know of the books called the Ein Yaakov. Now, the Rebbe, in his great wisdom, builds upon the idea relevant to this matter, and he connected it to the month of Elul. And it's in the Likutei Sichos, in the volumes here in back of me. And the Rebbe provides us with beautiful words of wisdom. It's like guidance for personal accounting that we are all required to do during this time of the year before Rosh Hashanah. And he says, more than a collection of days, each with its own work and deserving its own payment, every life is like an ongoing story. The entirety of this life sees man tasked with his own unique role and mission in building God's home in this world. So a person is given, everyone, when they're born, they're given a certain number of moments, or days, or months, years, in which they must build the world to serve God's holiness. But you're building this world to serve holiness for himself, his family, and those around you. That means that and every single day in that journey is another stage of the project, working towards the completion of a man's divine mission in his whole life. So every day is also an opportunity to fix the day before it, to rebuild anything that may have been failed or something that eroded, something that became damaged with time, so that when it comes after 120 years, a person lives a complete life, that person can return their soul whole, perfect, elevated, back to its maker. So with such a contract in hand, we get paid not by the hour, not by the week, or not by the year. We get paid by the job. So payment therefore comes due when the project is complete, at the conclusion of one's life, in this world here. And as soon as the contract is complete, God pays his invoice. You remember Alfred Nobel? He was a Swedish chemist. He was an engineer. He was an inventor. And his most famous invention was dynamite. He actually patented dynamite in 1867. And the story goes that the day after the death of his brother, he had a brother Ludwig, Alfred opened a French newspaper and was shocked actually to find an obituary mistakenly published of himself instead of his brother. And he was alive reading his own obituary. And what did the obituary state about his life? He's reading it. It said, "The merchant of death is dead." And it describes Alfred, the man who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before with dynamite. Now, apart from the shock of reading his own obituary, which that itself was shocking, because he was alive, he was stunned. Do you know how he's going to be remembered? You know what the people are going to say about him? When the truth that he was the man who brought death, when dynamite was actually intended for civilian applications, like if you had to blast tunnels or dams or mines, and he's going to be remembered the man of death? He recovered from his shock and he realized that by reading his own obituary, he was given an invaluable gift. You know what? He was given the gift to rewrite the story of his life. Inspired, he decided to create an institution which would recognize those who bring great gifts that benefit mankind. And we all know, upon his death in 1896, this Alfred Nobel bequeathed all of his remaining assets to fund what we call the Nobel Prize. First time it was awarded in 1901, and it's still awarded until today in the areas of physics and chemistry, psychology, medicine, literature, and peace. So life is an extended construction project in which every person at every moment can redefine his entire life. And human life is not just a personal project for me, the individual. We're actually part of a grand master plan that envelops all of humanity for all of the time, for today and tomorrow. And when did the project begin? 5,700, almost 85 years ago with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it continues until the coming of Mashiach. May it happen soon, God willing. All of reality is actually, it's an ongoing process of fixing and improving the world. It's a process which every generation builds upon that was built by the prior generations before it. A fascinating example of this principle of progressive generational progress was actually something that we spoke about a while back. Take a look in the first book of the Torah, the book of Genesis. It actually has a sequence of 5 cycles of family discord. In some cases, it ended up in murder, fragmentation, betrayal. What was the first story? The 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. And then the second story was the brothers Isaac and Ishmael. The third story was Jacob and Esau. And the fourth story was Joseph and his brothers. And finally, the 5th story was Manasseh and Ephraim, the 2 brothers. And even at the beginning of book of Exodus, there's a tension between Moses and his brother. And the sequence of fight after fight from generation to generation seems like a tragic failure of humanity. Cain and Abel and the patriarchs and Joseph and so on and so forth. But if you read these stories carefully, there's actually an astonishing fact. Far from a downward spiral getting worse and worse with time, we actually find that all in all, there's actually a process of progression towards forgiveness and peace. Because each generation carried forward from where its predecessor stopped. It added another layer of love, another layer of reconciliation. For example, what was the first quarrel in the Torah? Cain and Abel. You know how it ended. One brother kills the other brother. Then comes the second story of Isaac and Ishmael. It ended on a better note, a separation, as Ishmael goes to live with his mother, while Isaac lived with his father. And in the next chapter, things got even a little better, as we find the reconciliation. Jacob flees from Esau, his brother. He actually lives outside of the land of Israel for 34 years. But what happens in the end? They reunite, they hug, they kiss, they embrace. It's getting better as the generations go on. And then in the 4th cycle, we find forgiveness. Joseph looked past his brother's misdeeds when they sold him, and provides for them and their families for the rest of their life. And by the time the 5th cycle, the dispute is essentially mooted from the outset. Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh sees his younger brother being favored by their grandfather. But he gave the blessings to the younger brother before or greater than the older brother. He just accepts them gracefully. He never resents his younger brother. And then we come to the beginning of Exodus. We reach the ultimate resolution in the cycle of family tension. We see Moses, the younger brother. He becomes the leader of the Jewish people. And his older brother, Aaron, instead of being upset, why didn't I get it? Why did my younger brother get it? Why was my younger brother chosen? He humbly steps up to the plate to serve as Moses' interpreter. You see, friends, history is not just a random collection of individual people or stories of generations doing their own thing. It's actually structured. It's a process in which the divine presence becomes more and more manifest in the lower realms. And indeed, if we take a broader look at our world, the world of chaos that we're in today, we can see with our own eyes how reality is progressively moving towards redemption. Scrutinizing one single moment or another, perhaps the world might look frightfully alarming, a cause for despair. But if you simply zoom out and you look at the big picture, something of 5,000 years plus, it's obvious the world is advancing towards something tremendous. Just like in a field of science and technology, the world is moving in leaps and bounds as it advances in civilization, in faith, and in morality. And you know, friends, they say if you want to know how bad the world is, read newspapers. If you want to know how good the world is, study history. Because history shows us that things are getting far better, not worse. As the following few examples I'll just point out to you. Take, for example, faith. 4,000 years ago, the world believed in idols of wood and stone. Mankind, masses of people worshipped inanimate objects, praying to them for rain. Only one man, Abraham, he dared to challenge them all. He challenged the global order, and he was thrown into a fiery furnace. Miraculously came out alive. And 4,000 years later, Abraham's faith prevailed with billions of people believing in one God beyond nature. Take the sanctity of life. In days of old, a father would take his children for entertainment. Where did they go? They went to a coliseum. They watched the gladiators viciously, with cruelness, tearing apart other people into pieces. And for millennia, it was accepted that people could be punished cruelty with torture. Today, 4,000 years after God commanded, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, and his prohibition against causing distress to animals, humanity has become much more humane and compassionate. Today, in many places, a person can be arrested for harming a stray cat. A little to the extreme. So take a look at what's going on in the world. Throughout history, the norm has been war, conquest, and the survival of the fittest. And we have that today. But the world has lost much tolerance for war, even with war. Even powerful people, like some of the leaders in the world, have become Putin and Assad and others and the Hamas and so on and so forth. They become internationally despised for their aggressions. And they can hardly even leave their own borders. So what does all this mean for us here? Every day has its work. Every generation has its contribution to make the world a better place. No one stands alone. There's no generation that lives in a vacuum. Yesterday's work didn't end yesterday. It continues today. And the question is not, how much did I accomplish in the past? But what are we going to do to add it today for the tomorrow and the next day? And friends, this is what the month of Elul is all about. What am I building? How much progress and growth and development am I affecting in my own life in the past year? Because if there is no growth, God forbid, not only is today lacking, but the entire project's at risk. And the same applies to our greater generation. What matters is not really how great our ancestors were, what kind of great grandparents we have, and I'm sure they were great indeed. What matters really is our generation. What is our generation going to do with these unique abilities and circumstances given to us to add to the next stage of the project and bring us to the finish line of the coming of Mashiach? And I conclude with this thought. The Torah says in the book of Genesis, Eila Toldes Adam, which means this is the book of the generations of man. It's a history is a book, and we must write our chapter. Everyone writes their own chapter. That's the calling of man. I quote the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who made this point with a most brilliant analogy. He says, I have a dream, and it goes like this. You are wandering through an enormous library. It has millions of books. And you're wandering through, and you're looking at all the titles of the books, and then you suddenly stop. You stop dead in your tracks. You know why? There's a book, and on the title, it has your name. You take it out. You open it up. And you see there's several hundred pages of that book written by many different hands in many languages. You try to work it out. What's with this book? With your name? What's it all about? And with a shock, you realize that this book has been written by your ancestors. Every single one of them has written a chapter. They all wrote a chapter telling their story, and they handed it on to their children. And as you get to the end of the book, with a shock, you see an empty page with your name on it. And you realize that this is the chapter that you have to write. Now you're in the middle of this library. Can you just put that book on the shelf and walk away and forget about it? I don't think you really can do that. Because if you did, all those hundreds of generations of your ancestors would have had this book going would have been in vain. Because it would stop with you. I know I couldn't do it. If they put their faith in their children to keep this book going, then they have all put their faith in me. And I have to write my chapter in that book. And when the time comes, give the book to my children, who will give it to their children and my great-grandchildren. For to be a Jew is to be part of the most remarkable story ever lived by any people, covering more countries, more adverse circumstances, more triumphs and tragedies than any other story. And then the sudden realization that everyone has a chapter to write in that story and hand the book on. That is what it means to be a Jew. And particularly, very particular during this month, right before Rosh Hashanah, the month of Elul, before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And the second I realized that, I knew I couldn't walk away. I had to write my chapter and then give the book to my children and my grandchildren for them to continue the story until the coming of Mashiach. Be well, friends. May the next week be filled with meaning, with purpose, as we write another page and another page in the book of our story. And then we're going to come to Rosh Hashanah, and God is going to see the beautiful story, the beautiful life that we're living. He'll say, let me bless you with another year filled with good health, with joy, with happiness, with prosperity, with no challenges, only goodness and kindness, so you can continue writing that book and writing that story and fulfilling the dreams and aspirations of our ancestors, which ultimately will lead to the time of the great reward with the coming of Mashiach. May it happen now. Amen.